When 10-year-old Daniel Carter locked eyes with a stranger across a crowded McDonald's dining room in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and silently mouthed three desperate words, "I'm being taken," the massive biker eating a Big Mac alone in the corner made a split-second decision that would transform an ordinary Tuesday lunch into a standoff that brought police, Child Protective Services, and eventually the FBI to a fast food parking lot. What started as one observant man noticing a terrified child would unravel a custody violation that had crossed 3 state lines and prove that sometimes the bravest thing a kid can do is ask a complete stranger for help, and the most heroic thing an adult can do is refuse to look away when every instinct says it's not your business. This is the story of how Kyle Hammer Jensen, Sergeant-at-Arms for the Thunder Road Motorcycle Club, trusted his gut over social norms and turned what could have been a tragic disappearance into a rescue that would change how he saw his role in the world. The McDonald's on East 11th Street in Tulsa was packed on a Tuesday in mid-September, the lunch rush in full swing with the kind of controlled chaos that made everyone anonymous. Construction workers grabbing quick meals, office employees on break, parents with small children navigating trays and high chairs, retirees taking advantage of senior coffee discounts. It was the kind of everyday American scene where people existed in their own bubbles, focused on their food and phones and conversations, barely registering the strangers around them. Kyle Hammer Jensen sat alone in a corner booth, his 6'4" frame taking up more space than the plastic seating was designed for. He was 46 years old, a welder by trade, and Sergeant-at-Arms for the Thunder Road Motorcycle Club out of Oklahoma City. His leather vest hung on the seat beside him, too hot to wear inside but never left behind. The patches told his story: Thunder Road rocker across the back, Sergeant-at-Arms designation, veteran patch showing Marine Corps service in Iraq, various pins commemorating rides and causes and brothers lost. His arms were covered in tattoos, his beard was thick and going gray, and his hands bore the scars of 20 years working with metal and fire. He looked exactly like what nervous suburban parents warned their kids about, which made it ironic that he was about to become a child's only hope. Kyle was halfway through his burger when he felt it, that prickling awareness that came from years of combat in street situations, the sense that someone was watching him with intensity. He looked up and his eyes met those of a boy sitting 3 tables away. The kid was maybe 10 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that hung in his eyes and a face that was too pale, too tight with tension. He wore a Pokemon t-shirt that looked slept in and jeans with grass stains on the knees. Beside him sat a man in his late 30s, heavy-set with thinning hair and a nervous energy that Kyle's instincts immediately flagged as wrong. The man was eating quickly, checking his phone constantly, his free hand resting on the boy's shoulder in a grip that looked more like containment than affection. Kyle went back to his food but kept the pair in his peripheral vision, that old Marine awareness never fully switching off. Something was off about them. The boy wasn't eating, just sitting rigid and still while the man shoveled down a quarter-pounder. The kid kept looking around the restaurant with quick, furtive glances, scanning faces like he was searching for something or someone. His small hands were clenched into fists on the table, knuckles white with tension that no child should carry while sitting in a McDonald's. Then it happened. The boy's eyes found Kyle's again, and this time they locked on with desperate intensity. The kid stared at him for maybe 3 seconds, and Kyle saw something in those eyes that made his blood run cold. Not just fear, but calculated desperation, the look of someone who'd made a decision and was committed despite being terrified. The boy glanced quickly at the man beside him, who was absorbed in his phone, then looked back at Kyle, and very deliberately, very carefully, the kid mouthed 3 words, his lips moving in exaggerated shapes to make sure Kyle understood. "I'm being taken." Kyle felt everything in him go still. The boy mouthed it again, slower, making absolutely certain there was no misunderstanding. "I'm being taken." Then the boy's eyes flicked toward the exit, toward the parking lot where Kyle had noticed a blue sedan with Texas plates when he'd pulled in on his bike. The kid looked back at Kyle with a pleading expression that asked the question his voice couldn't. "Will you help me?" And then the man's hand tightened on his shoulder, and the boy's face went carefully blank. Kyle set down his burger, his mind shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive in Fallujah. He'd worked enough community outreach with Thunder Road, enough toy runs and school visits to know what a scared kid looked like versus a kid in real danger. This wasn't a custody dispute tantrum or a child being dramatic about not getting chicken nuggets. This was genuine terror being held under a thin veneer of compliance. The boy was asking for help in the only way he could, silently, desperately, trusting a stranger because there was no one else. The man stood abruptly, his hand still gripping the boy's shoulder, and told him to come on. They needed to get back on the road. His voice was loud enough to carry, performatively normal, like he was establishing for anyone listening that this was just a dad and his son. But the boy's face when he stood showed something else entirely. That practiced obedience that came from fear rather than respect. The way he moved like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. The desperate last look he shot toward Kyle as the man steered him toward the exit. Kyle stood, grabbed his vest, and followed them out into the parking lot. His mind was already running calculations. If he was wrong, if this was actually a father and son and he was about to make a complete ass of himself, then he'd apologize and deal with the embarrassment. But if he was right, if that kid was being taken against his will, then looking foolish was a small price to pay for potentially saving a child's life. He'd rather be wrong 100 times than ignore a legitimate cry for help even once. The September sun was brutal after the air-conditioned restaurant. Kyle watched the man walk the boy toward the blue sedan, a Honda Accord with Texas plates that Kyle memorized automatically. The man was moving fast, trying to get the kid into the car and gone before anyone could ask questions. Kyle walked to his bike, which he'd deliberately parked near the exit, pulled out his phone, and positioned himself so he had a clear view of the sedan. The man opened the back door and told the boy to get in. The kid hesitated just for a second and turned to look back at the McDonald's entrance, at Kyle standing beside his Harley. The boy's expression was pure, desperate hope, the look of someone who'd thrown their last lifeline and was waiting to see if anyone would catch it. Kyle made his decision. He walked directly toward the Honda, his phone already dialing 911, his massive frame moving with purpose that made the man look up sharply. The man's face shifted from annoyance to concern when he saw this large biker approaching with clear intent. He told the boy to get in the car now, his voice sharp with authority that expected immediate obedience. But Kyle was already speaking into his phone, his voice carrying across the parking lot deliberately. "This is Kyle Jensen at the McDonald's on East 11th Street in Tulsa. I need police here immediately. There's a man attempting to leave with a child who signaled to me for help. I'm blocking the vehicle exit, and I need units here now. Blue Honda Accord, Texas plates," and he recited the number he'd memorized. The dispatcher's voice sharpened with the kind of focus that meant she understood the urgency. "Sir, maintain your position if it's safe to do so. Units are being dispatched. Can you describe the subjects?" Kyle provided descriptions while the man started shouting at him, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, saying this was his son and Kyle needed to mind his own business. But Kyle noticed the man didn't try to leave, didn't try to force the boy into the car because he'd seen Kyle position himself in his bike in a way that would make exiting the parking lot difficult, and because causing a scene was the last thing someone with something to hide wanted to do. The boy was standing frozen between the open car door and the man, his eyes huge, watching Kyle like he was witnessing a miracle. Kyle kept his phone on speaker so the dispatcher could hear everything, kept his body between the bike and the car, kept his voice calm and steady when he told the man that police were on their way and they could all wait together and clear this up. If everything was legitimate, then there was no problem. But if the kid was in trouble, then Kyle wasn't letting that car leave. The man's face was red now, blustering about lawsuits and harassment, about how dare Kyle accuse him of anything, how this was his son Daniel, and they were just traveling through on their way to visit family in Missouri. But his hands were shaking and his eyes kept darting to the parking lot exit, and Kyle had spent enough years reading people in high-stress situations to know guilt when he saw it. This man was terrified of police arrival, and that terror told Kyle everything he needed to know about whether he'd made the right call. 2 Tulsa Police Department cruisers pulled into the parking lot within 4 minutes, lights blazing. Officers emerged, and the lead officer, a woman in her 30s with sergeant stripes, approached with her hand near her weapon but not on it, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. She saw a large biker standing near his motorcycle, saw a man who looked defensive and angry, saw a small boy who looked like he was about to cry with relief. She asked Kyle to explain what was happening, and he told her calmly that the child in question had made eye contact with him inside the restaurant and silently mouthed that he was being taken, that the boy appeared terrified and under duress, and that Kyle had called police rather than let them leave until someone could verify the child's safety. The sergeant turned to the man and asked for identification and documentation of his relationship to the child. The man fumbled for his wallet, producing a Texas driver's license that showed his name as Robert Mitchell from Dallas. When asked about documentation proving Daniel was his son, birth certificate or custody papers or anything, the man said those were back at his apartment, said he didn't carry that stuff around, said this was ridiculous and he had rights. The sergeant's expression shifted slightly, that professional mask that cops wore when something confirmed their suspicions. She walked over to Daniel, knelt down to his eye level in a way that was non-threatening, and asked the boy directly what his name was and whether he was safe. And Daniel, this small 10-year-old who'd been holding everything together through what Kyle could only imagine was days of terror, looked at the officer and his face crumpled. His voice was barely above a whisper when he said his name was Daniel Carter, not Daniel Mitchell, that this man wasn't his dad, that he took him from his school in Houston 5 days ago and had been driving him around since then, that he'd told Daniel if he tried to get help, something bad would happen to his mom. The sergeant's whole demeanor changed. She stood, spoke quickly into her radio using codes that Kyle recognized as requesting immediate backup and child protective services, and her partner moved to secure Robert Mitchell, who was now stammering that the kid was lying, that he was confused, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the officer was already reading him his rights, already putting him in handcuffs, while the sergeant stayed with Daniel and told him in a gentle but firm voice that he was safe now, that no one was going to hurt him or his mother, that he did exactly the right thing by asking for help. More units arrived, an unmarked detective's car, a child protective services vehicle. The McDonald's manager came out asking what was happening in his parking lot. Customers were gathering at the windows. And Kyle stood beside his motorcycle, watching this unfold, feeling something massive and overwhelming in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Relief that he'd trusted his gut, rage at what this kid had been through, gratitude that Daniel had been brave enough to ask a stranger for help, gratitude that Kyle had been the kind of person who looked like he might actually do something when asked. A detective approached Kyle, introduced herself as Detective Linda Torres, and asked him to explain exactly what he'd observed. Kyle walked her through everything, the boy's body language, the way he'd locked eyes and mouthed those 3 words, the man's controlling grip and nervous behavior, the desperate hope in Daniel's face when Kyle had refused to let them leave. Torres took notes and told Kyle that his intervention likely saved this child from whatever Robert Mitchell had planned for him, that cases like this often didn't end well once the perpetrator got their victim to a secondary location. She explained that Daniel Carter had been reported missing from his elementary school in Houston 5 days ago, that he'd been doing homework on a bench outside the building, waiting for his mother to pick him up, when Robert Mitchell, who'd been surveilling the school for weeks, grabbed him and told him his mother sent him. Mitchell had driven Daniel through Texas, Oklahoma, and was apparently heading toward Kansas when they'd stopped for lunch. During those 5 days, Daniel had been moved between motels, kept isolated, told repeatedly that if he tried to escape or ask for help, that Mitchell had people who would hurt his mother back in Houston. Torres told Kyle that Daniel had tried to signal other adults twice before, once at a gas station in Dallas and once at a rest stop outside Oklahoma City. But both times the adults had either not noticed or not understood or simply chosen not to get involved. The boy had been losing hope, had started to believe that maybe no one would help, that maybe he was going to disappear and never see his mother again. But then he saw Kyle, this big, intimidating biker eating alone, and something in Daniel's 10-year-old instinct told him that this man would actually do something if asked. And he'd been right. Kyle felt his throat tighten when Torres explained all of this, thinking about those other 2 adults who'd looked away or missed the signs, about how close Daniel had come to vanishing completely. The detective told him they'd already contacted Daniel's mother in Houston, that she was driving up immediately and should arrive in about 4 hours, that Daniel would be evaluated by medical personnel and counselors in the meantime. Torres said Kyle would need to give a formal statement, but that his willingness to act on what he saw, to risk looking foolish or causing a scene, had directly resulted in this child going home instead of becoming another statistic. Kyle asked if he could talk to Daniel before everything got too official, before the boy got swept up in the machinery of investigation and protection. Torres considered for a moment, then nodded and walked him over to where Daniel was sitting in the back of a patrol car with the door open, a female officer sitting with him, the boy wrapped in a blanket despite the September heat, because shock did that to people. Torres spoke quietly to the officer, who nodded and stepped aside, giving Kyle space. Kyle knelt down so he was at Daniel's eye level, this massive man making himself small for a scared child. He told the boy his name was Kyle, that people called him Hammer because of his job, and that he wanted Daniel to know something important. The boy looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, his face still showing the tear tracks from crying. Kyle told him that what he did inside that McDonald's, making eye contact and asking for help even though he was terrified, was one of the bravest things Kyle had ever seen anyone do. He said that took more courage than anything Kyle had done in Iraq, more guts than any fight he'd been in, because Daniel had to trust a complete stranger when everything in his situation said he was alone. Daniel's voice was small when he said he tried to tell people before, but nobody helped, that he was scared nobody ever would. Kyle told him he understood that feeling, but the important thing was that Daniel never gave up trying, that he kept looking for someone who would listen. Kyle said sometimes you have to ask for help 5 times before someone finally hears you, and that doesn't mean the first 4 times were failures. It means you were brave enough to keep trying. He told Daniel that his mother was coming, that she'd been looking for him every single second he was gone, that she never stopped believing she'd find him. The boy asked Kyle if he really thought what he did was brave, his voice carrying the doubt of a child who'd been told for 5 days that no one cared, that no one would help, that he was powerless. Kyle said absolutely, that asking for help when you're scared isn't weakness, it's strength, and that Daniel had saved himself by being smart enough and brave enough to keep trying until he found someone who would act. He told the boy that what happened wasn't his fault, that the bad things Robert Mitchell did were Mitchell's choices, not Daniel's, and that the only thing Daniel did was survive and keep fighting to get home. Daniel nodded and then did something that broke Kyle open completely. The boy leaned forward and hugged him, this small child wrapping his arms around Kyle's neck and holding on like Kyle was the only solid thing in a world that had gone completely wrong. Kyle hugged him back carefully, this massive biker with his scarred hands and intimidating appearance, holding a terrified 10-year-old with the gentleness of someone who understood exactly how fragile and precious this moment was. When Daniel finally pulled back, he told Kyle, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not walking away." And Kyle had to clear his throat roughly before he could respond that he would never walk away from a kid who needed help. Never. If this story is reminding you that children in danger often try to signal adults in subtle ways that require us to truly pay attention, that looking intimidating doesn't mean someone isn't safe, and that being willing to cause a scene or risk embarrassment matters more than social comfort when a child's life might be at stake, then this matters because what happened next would prove that one person's willingness to act creates ripples that extend far beyond a single moment in a parking lot. Torres came back and told Kyle they needed to take Daniel to the hospital for evaluation and then to a child advocacy center where he could give his statement in a child-friendly environment. She thanked Kyle again, told him someone would contact him about his formal statement, and gave him her card in case he thought of anything else. Kyle watched them drive away with Daniel in the back of an unmarked car, the boy's small face visible through the window, still watching Kyle like he was something miraculous, rather than just a welder who'd trusted his gut. Kyle stayed at the McDonald's for another hour, giving his statement to uniformed officers, going over every detail of what he'd observed inside the restaurant and in the parking lot. Other customers who'd been inside came forward saying they'd seen the boy looking around strangely, but hadn't thought anything of it, hadn't registered it as anything more than a fidgety kid. One woman said she'd noticed the boy seemed scared but assumed it was just a father-son tension thing and didn't want to interfere in family business. The guilt in her voice when she said that was palpable, the realization that her desire not to make things awkward had almost cost a child his freedom or his life. When Kyle finally got back on his bike and headed toward Oklahoma City, he couldn't stop thinking about those 3 words. I'm being taken. 3 words mouthed silently across a crowded restaurant by a desperate child who'd been failed twice before and was taking one more chance on being seen, on being heard, on being worth someone's intervention. Kyle thought about all the times people saw things that felt wrong, but talked themselves out of acting because it was probably nothing, because they didn't want to make a scene, because what if they were wrong and made someone uncomfortable? And he thought about how Daniel would have disappeared if Kyle had made those same calculations, if he'd valued social comfort over a child's desperate signal. The story hit local news that evening and went statewide by the next morning. Biker stops. Child abduction at Tulsa McDonald's was the headline, with Kyle's photo from his Thunder Road member page showing him in full leather and patches looking exactly like someone suburban America was taught to fear. The Thunder Road clubhouse phone started ringing with media requests, community members wanting to express gratitude, other motorcycle clubs calling to say, "Good job, brother." But Kyle didn't want attention or recognition. He wanted to know that Daniel was okay, that his mother had arrived, that the kid was going to be able to heal from what he'd been through. Detective Torres called him 2 days later with an update. She told him Daniel had been reunited with his mother, Stephanie Carter, and the reunion had been everything you'd hope for. Tears and holding each other and the kind of relief that was almost painful to witness. Robert Mitchell was being charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and a list of other charges that would likely keep him in prison for decades. The FBI had gotten involved because Mitchell had crossed state lines, and they were investigating whether he'd targeted other children before Daniel. Torres said the boy was in therapy, was doing remarkably well considering the trauma, and that he'd asked about Kyle multiple times, wanted to know if he could thank the biker man properly. Kyle said he didn't need thanks, that he'd just done what anyone should do when a kid asks for help. But Torres corrected him gently, saying actually that's not what most people do. Most people look away or convince themselves it's not their business, or decide the risk of being wrong is too great. She said Kyle's willingness to trust his instinct and act despite social pressure was unusual and valuable, and that Daniel's mother wanted to meet him if Kyle was willing. They arranged to meet at a park in Oklahoma City on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the McDonald's incident. Kyle arrived early on his bike and saw them waiting at a picnic table. Stephanie Carter, a woman in her mid-30s with Daniel's same dark hair and a face that showed both exhaustion and profound gratitude. Daniel was sitting beside her wearing a Thunder Road t-shirt that Kyle recognized as one the club gave to kids at their toy runs, and when the boy saw Kyle, he jumped up and ran over with none of the fear or hesitation he'd shown before. Daniel hugged him immediately and told Kyle that his mom said he saved his life, that the police told them Robert Mitchell had bad plans, and if they'd gotten to Kansas, things would have been really bad. The boy's voice was stronger than it had been in that parking lot, still carrying shadows of what he'd been through, but also carrying hope and recovery. Kyle told him he was just glad Daniel was home safe, that he was proud of how brave the boy had been. Stephanie approached, and she was crying before she even reached them. She told Kyle she didn't know how to thank someone for giving her back her child, that the 5 days Daniel was missing were the worst of her life, that every hour she thought she'd never see him again. She said the police told her that Daniel had tried to signal other adults before Kyle, and if Kyle hadn't paid attention, if he hadn't been willing to act, she would have lost her son forever. Her voice broke when she said forever, the weight of that word carrying all the nightmares she'd lived through. Kyle told her that Daniel saved himself by being smart and brave, that all Kyle did was pay attention when the boy asked for help. But Stephanie shook her head and said, no, paying attention was everything. Being willing to cause a scene and risk being wrong was everything, because most people won't do that. She said she'd spent 2 weeks thinking about all the people who must have seen Daniel looking scared or uncomfortable during those 5 days, all the adults who maybe noticed something off but didn't want to get involved, and how Kyle was the one who chose differently. She told Kyle that she'd taught Daniel about stranger danger his whole life, taught him not to talk to people he didn't know, to stay away from anyone who seemed scary. but she'd also taught him that if he was ever in real danger, he should look for helpers, look for police officers or firefighters or moms with kids. She never thought to tell him that sometimes helpers look like big, scary bikers, that sometimes the person who looks most intimidating is actually the safest person to ask. Stephanie said from now on she was teaching Daniel and his younger sister that danger doesn't have a look, and neither does safety, that you trust your instincts about who will help regardless of how they're dressed or what they look like. Kyle spent an hour with them at that park, listening to Daniel talk about starting therapy and going back to school, and how his friends all thought it was cool that a biker saved him. The boy asked Kyle questions about his motorcycle, about his club, about the patches on his vest. Kyle explained what Thunder Road stood for, the charity work they did, the veteran support programs, the way motorcycle clubs often became families for people who needed belonging. Daniel listened with intense interest, and then said he wanted to be in a motorcycle club when he grew up, wanted to be someone who helped people like Kyle helped him. Stephanie said something then that Kyle would carry with him for the rest of his life. She told him that when Daniel came home, he'd had nightmares every night, would wake up screaming and scared. But after meeting Kyle today, after seeing that the biker man was real and safe and cared about him, Daniel had told her he felt better, felt like maybe the world wasn't as scary as it seemed during those 5 days. She said Kyle represented something important to Daniel now, proof that there are adults who will help, who will listen, who will act when children need them. Over the following months, Kyle and Stephanie stayed in touch through occasional messages and updates. She sent him photos of Daniel at his birthday party, at a school event, gradually healing and reclaiming his childhood. Thunder Road Motorcycle Club started a program called Eyes Open Initiative after Daniel's rescue, running workshops at schools teaching kids that asking for help is brave, that helpers come in all forms, and that trusting your instincts about danger is important. They taught parents and teachers to recognize the subtle signs children show when they were in distress, to pay attention in public spaces, to be willing to act even when they might be wrong. 6 months after the McDonald's incident, Daniel and his mother showed up at a Thunder Road charity toy run. The boy was wearing his club t-shirt and carrying a drawing he'd made showing a stick figure child and a stick figure biker with a motorcycle, with the words, "Thank you for seeing me," written in careful 10-year-old handwriting across the top. Kyle had it framed, and it hung in the Thunder Road clubhouse as a reminder of why they rode, why community mattered, why paying attention could save lives. Daniel grew up knowing that his voice mattered, that asking for help was strength, not weakness, that he'd survived something terrible because he'd been brave enough to keep trying until someone listened. He became a confident kid who spoke at his school about trusting your instincts and asking for help when something feels wrong, who told other children that heroes don't always look like what you expect them to look like. And Kyle rode on with his brothers, carrying in his heart the knowledge that one moment of paying attention, one decision to act instead of looking away, had given a mother back her child and a child back his future. The story became part of Thunder Road's identity, a reminder that their role in the community wasn't just charity rides and fundraisers, but being present, being aware, being willing to be the kind of men who stopped when children needed them. Kyle kept Detective Torres's card in his wallet, along with a photo of Daniel at the park that day, smiling and safe and healing. It was a reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is believe a child who's asking for help, even when they're asking silently, even when acting means risking social embarrassment or looking foolish. Think about the public spaces you move through every day, the restaurants and stores and parking lots where life happens in full view but often goes unnoticed. Think about the children you pass who might be trying to signal something wrong in the only ways they can, through eye contact or body language, or carefully mouthed words that require someone to actually see them. Would you notice? Would you act? Would you be willing to cause a scene, to make things awkward, to risk being wrong if there was even the smallest chance a child needed help? Robert Mitchell is serving 35 years in federal prison. Daniel Carter is 14 now, thriving in high school, still in occasional contact with Kyle, still wearing Thunder Road gear, still telling anyone who will listen about the day a biker refused to let him disappear. And Kyle Jensen still rides with his brothers, still pays attention in public spaces, still believes that one person choosing to act when everyone else looks away can mean the difference between a child going home and a child becoming another missing face on a poster that no one can find. This story matters because children in danger are often trying desperately to signal adults in ways that require us to truly see them, to pay attention beyond our own concerns, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we can't immediately articulate why. Share this if it reminded you that helpers come in unexpected forms, that paying attention saves lives, that being willing to intervene matters more than social comfort, and that sometimes 3 words mouthed silently across a crowded room are all it takes to save a life if someone is watching who cares enough to act.